So, Dean, welcome back to the program.
Thanks very much, Art.
Do you carry, now that it's published, do you carry a copy of this book around just in case you get on a train and run into a couple like that now?
I don't, but after listening to you read the preface, I think what I should do is have you read the entire book, and then I'll have an audio version that I can give to people.
Yeah, I've done a couple of those. They're kind of fun, actually. That's a great preface, just a great preface. And, here, this program is such a mixture of people. I mean, there are the believers, the devotees, and then there's a very large core group of skeptics as well that listen to this program. I'm not sure why. I guess they want to hear how wild it can get, or that they want to be able to chuckle and know what's going on in the other camp. Or I don't know why they listen, but they are very skeptical, and they are out there listening tonight. So if you were, I'm afraid I've got to put you back into the preface again, and we've got to start sort of at the beginning. If you were going to try to convince somebody that a lot of aspects of all of this are real, Dean, and it was the 101 version, how would you do it?
Well, I think after having conversations like this for years with people, including many, many skeptics,
sure,
I've come to the conclusion that you can't convince anybody of anything, especially if you're starting from a strong position beforehand. And this goes for both believers and skeptics. It's extremely difficult to push somebody's belief away from where it is, provided that it's quite strong to begin with. And just to give you an example, from skeptics who read the preface, they come away thinking that I'm a super egotistical maniac of some type, because I'm making a claim in the preface that I think I know something. And of course, from their point of view, which is on the hard right in political terms, they think that they know what the truth is, and therefore anyone who says anything other than that is basically nuts. And on the other side, if somebody's coming from a strong left position, the New Age position, they will look at what I said and feel confused as to why I'm giving any credence at all to the skeptical side.
Well, in the middle, then, there must be some group of generally open-minded people that you could attempt to impress with what you consider to be facts or things that would convince one that at least some of this certainly is true.
Right. So the middle section is around 60% of the population.
That's quite a few.
Which is fortunate, but that does mean that there's 40% which we really can't push at all. And so for the 60%, it depends a lot on whether I'm talking to a popular audience or a scientific audience. For the scientists, I typically try to get an hour or so, and I present data, one screen after another in a PowerPoint show that shows results of experiments that have been replicated many times by people for the last 50 years.
And once men of hard science have seen this, what kind of reaction do you get?
Usually what happens is the lecture will end, and then they'll all rush up to the podium and ask questions like, is that for real? Are you telling, like, this is for real? And they get all excited because the implications of this for science in general are astounding. So in a few cases, the scientists will go off and try to replicate some of these effects.
That's what science does.
Well, a very small percentage will do it. And the reason is that, we all have our own agendas, and we're oftentimes paid to research in a given area, and we don't have the luxury of being able to drop everything and try a new experiment. But it does happen, and it happens often enough that we're able to advance the state of the art.
The difficulty, of course, that all of us have is that intertwined with the reality of PSI and the reality, perhaps, of global consciousness, and so much more that we talk about on this program, in the periphery of all this, or even mixed squarely within, are some people who, frankly, are off on fits of fancy or whatever, and they do the whole concept a fair amount of damage.
Absolutely. Now, it is much, we think about any discipline, whether any controversial discipline, that includes things like cold fusion and the few people who are seriously trying to research UFOs and
yes.
so on,
Yes.
We're hurt far more by people who make wild claims than we are by people who are making highly skeptical remarks.
Yes.
And the reason is that we get painted by a very broad brush. So if you have somebody who's making wild claims, that brush is going to drip over on us, and then a skeptic will look at us and assume that what I'm saying, for example, or what I've written in my book, is more New Age silliness. And the consequence is that they simply won't pay any attention to it.
Sure.
That's the problem.
Well, I would think it's much like I'm sure the government's position must be with respect to UFOs. Whether or not UFOs exist, one thing we know for sure, and that is our government is testing very exotic new aircraft that are frequently mistaken for UFOs.
Mm-hmm.
So having ufologists out there and having UFO reports from the government's point of view must just be a real bonus.
Well, in the UFO business, it probably does actually help. You know, it helps to confuse people as to what may be real and what isn't, because you're right. There are all kinds of interesting and exotic aircraft out there which the government would just rather we didn't know about yet.
So, from a government's point of view, why dissuade some poor soul who thinks he just saw something from Venus?
Exactly. Of course, there is another side to that story. I was once speaking to a friend of mine who works at the CIA, and in a sense is the real life Mulder from X-Files, the person who is given the crazy things to track down.
Really?
One of the things that he was looking into, and I have to preface this by saying I don't know very much about the UFO field. That's not my area. But I speak to people who are knowledgeable about this. And so I asked him, what does he think about UFOs, given that he's had the opportunity to investigate. He pretty much dismissed all of it as it's our stuff, basically, with one exception. And that was the exception having to do with cattle mutilation. At that time, I had never even heard about the cattle mutilation business. I assume that your listeners will know about it.
Oh, yes, indeed.
Okay, so he was on a number of quick reaction responses to calls for something is funny happening with the cattle.
Yes.
And, of course, the reason why the CIA and others got involved is because the farmers went to their senators, and the senators went up, and then, you know, the message came from on high, go figure out what's going on here because you're making some cattlemen angry.
Mm-hmm.
So to make a long story short, whatever is happening with some of the cattle mutilations, it looks like it is a real phenomenon. It's not just predators doing their thing.
Many times, Dean, there have been reports of eyewitnesses seeing cattle actually rising to craft, all that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, they're being dumped. And, God, the stories, Linda Moulton Howe covers this in great detail frequently. No one's ever caught. Right. Ever. So.
And the important point here is the people who investigate and get there very quickly do not know what it is. And you can imagine that if it were common knowledge, that people who you would hope would know what's going on, people who can get there quickly and have spy satellites and all methods that can be used to figure it out, and they cannot, that would be somewhat disruptive. Mm-hmm. So it's simply easier for the mainstream message to be, well, there's nothing to it, just so that we don't disturb people.
Do you have any thoughts on what might be up with any of that, by the way?
Well, my own sense is that we're not dealing with ET in the sense of hardware, you know, or even with extraterrestrial intelligence. Instead, my own bias here is because I tend to take a psychological view of these things, mm-hmm. is that the distinction between the subjective and the objective is nowhere near as clean as we usually think. That there is something like an imaginal world. It's the world that's living in between the subjective side, or, you know, the world inside your head,
yes, and
the objective, which is the world outside your head. There's a middle world, the imaginal world. That world sometimes actually manifests. So what it has to do with cattle mutilations, I have absolutely no idea.
But it could, I guess you're suggesting it could be a manifestation of this portion of the mind?
It could be something like a collective mind or maybe individuals' minds that are manifesting in a physical way, but only quasi-physical. See? And the reason I say this is based on 50 years of laboratory experiments which show that there is a relationship between what goes on inside your head and what goes on outside in a direct way.
What are some of the greatest examples of any physical manifestation of the mind that you can name?
Well, rather than saying specific experiment, I think it's actually more persuasive to talk about classes of experiments.
Okay.
So one of the classic experiments we have are mental intention being directed at random events. An electronic circuit creating streams of random bits.
Man controlling machine.
But directly, through the mind. And the hypothesis is actually very simple. It assumes that mind and matter are complementary in the sense that they're like two sides of the same coin. They're different than each other, but they're linked in a very solid way that makes them go together. So under that model, that hypothesis, if the mind becomes very quiet through meditation or through high attention or something that makes the mind quiet, then the hypothesis says, well, maybe the matter side will also become quiet. If we think about this from like an internal body state, if you sit down to meditate and your mind is all agitated before you settle down, your body actually tends to be agitated as well.
Right.
After a while, your mind begins to calm down and your body becomes quiet. So by analogy, if mind and matter are linked, then if you have somebody sit down and meditate and they become extremely quiet both inside their mind and their body, then perhaps in the vicinity you will find that physical systems that are not connected to the person will also become quiet. The way we test that is with randomness, because it's very easy to detect when randomness is no longer acting quite as random.
It's also the feather touch, isn't it? In other words, I would think that increasingly difficult would be moving or affecting large or heavier objects. But when you're talking about randomness, you're talking about a computer program that's running, is spitting out as something eternally random. So it's a feather touch experiment in a way, isn't it?
Yes, although the source of the randomness is not a computer algorithm. It's not a computer software.
All right. Well, we'll talk about what it is in a moment. We're at the bottom of the hour. But once again, Dean Radin. Dean, you were saying the generator of the randomness in this case we're talking about was not a computer.
That's right.
But rather what?
The source is typically electronic noise through something like Zener diode, which creates something called electron tunneling, which is a quantum effect.
Right.
Or we have a new type of random generator, which is based on the decision that a photon makes when it hits a half-silvered mirror.
Uh-huh.
And that also is a quantum process. So ultimately, the random events that we're working with are quantum physical processes, which are, as far as we can tell, completely random. So the point of using these is that you're right. It's like a feather touch. It would take close to no energy at all in order to influence the effect. And it also is convenient because these things are very easy to monitor with a computer, so you can have completely automated experiments. So
Dean, excuse me. Do you think, Dean, that the feather touch experiments that you're doing are necessary because of the nature of the power of the mind to influence such events, being inherently weak at this point? And do you think that we are at its very beginning of development? In other words, do you think that power could be increased, perhaps, and focused to produce more than a feather touch?
That's an excellent question. What a good question. A complete answer would take around 6 hours. But the short answer, I think, is that we're dealing with something which is very similar to talent, like sports talent.
Sure.
We consider how many people make it into the Olympics out of the pool of possible people. And we're probably dealing with something like 1/1000th of a percent of the population have the physical qualities and probably the mental qualities to be able to do Olympic-level sports. So somewhere at that level, there are people who have mental capabilities that are way beyond other people. And in fact, if you look in history at people who are able to repeatedly do what we call macroscopic movements, moving things that you can see moving. You don't need statistics in order to see it.
Yes.
It's the fingers on one hand are the number of people who have reliable witnesses saying that, yes, something seemed to have occurred.
But would you affirm, can you affirm that, in fact, those people you can count on one hand really do exist?
I think they do. And I'm much more convinced of that now than I was even 5 years ago. And the reason is that, and this goes, by the way, across the board for any kind of psychic claim, that if somebody makes a strong claim, like bending metal or moving an object,
yes,
I think I'm like most people in that basically I don't have any reason to believe it unless not only do I see it happen, but even better, if I can do it myself.
Yes.
Because otherwise I don't have any basis to believe it. So I certainly have had friends that have said, and when it comes to metal bending in particular, that they've bent a metal bar that you can't bend physically, or that they've bent a spoon or something like that. And I said, oh yeah, I'm thinking in the back of my mind that they're probably dissociated and they don't know their own strength and all of the usual explanations.
Isn't that interesting? I mean, it really is interesting that you would say that short of being able to do it yourself, no amount of observation of anybody else doing it would be satisfactory. We live in a world of illusion being almost the norm, don't we?
Well, but for good reason. I mean, as I say in the book over and over again, it's extremely easy to be fooled. And so anybody who starts looking into psychic phenomena, if they're not also reasonably well trained in close-up magic and illusion techniques, to say nothing of ordinary psychological problems, then you're going to fool yourself fairly quickly. Mm-hmm. So I've spent a fair amount of time when I used to live in Las Vegas. I would hang out in the magic shops. And, for example, a couple of years ago, somebody came to me claiming that they could bend metal. And to prepare for this person coming to the lab, I went to the local magic shop and I said, can you show me a trick or something that I can buy to bend a spoon?
Right.
And then he said, well, I have 8 different methods. Which trick would you like to get? So I bought all of them.
Yes.
And this is one of the reasons why magicians in particular are so skeptical, because they know that it's very easy to be fooled. So I've been very skeptical. In fact, I'm skeptical across the board.
Well, I'm curious. When this person strolled into your lab and did his spoon bending, were you able to bust him on the spot?
Not on the spot, no.
Really?
No, we had 2 video cameras on him. At the time, it looked real. And we had 2 cameras in 2 different angles because, and in fact, the camera people were told, one of you to do a close-up on the hand and the spoon, and the other one get a wider shot.
Uh-huh.
Just because oftentimes there's a distraction that goes on.
Sure.
And it's changed. So we were able to tell both from the wide shot and the close-up that what we were seeing was an illusion. And it was incredibly good. But we could see it when we went back frame by frame and see how the trick was done. So
but it was a trick.
It was a trick. Yes. It was a good trick, but it was a trick.
But a trick.
Yeah.
Around the world, including in Russia, there have been reports of fascinating experiments of people doing all kinds of things, bending laser beams and light and all the rest of it. Anything to all of that? Well,
again, 5 years ago, I would have said my probability meter was quite low. Today, my probability meter is a little bit higher, and it's because of a personal experience. And I wouldn't expect anybody to to accept it, but I'm just saying this. For me, my meter has changed a little bit because something happened which I know cannot occur through illusion or force.
All right, this I would be very much interested in hearing about.
Okay, so I went to one of these PK metal bending parties that Jack Houck often gives. Mm-hmm. The reason I went there is because I wanted to sit within a foot or two of somebody who said that they did something which I know cannot be done by force, which is to take a large soup spoon and bend the bowl of the spoon. Bend the bowl over.
Yes.
Not to bend the neck, which is fairly easy, but to bend the bowl.
Okay.
I've measured how much force it takes to do that, and I know that no ordinary person without some kind of leverage can do that with their hands.
Right.
So I found a lady who said that she had done it before, so I sat down about a foot and a half from her and watched very closely because I wanted to see this happen. At the same time, I was holding a spoon and I was trying to mimic what she was doing. Mm-hmm. And it's a big, heavy, old-fashioned type soup spoon. So I'm watching her, nothing's happening, and then somebody points out to me, look what you did, meaning look what I did. And I had somehow managed to bend the bowl of the spoon about halfway over.
Oh, my goodness.
And then, yes, I'm looking at it thinking to myself, oh, my goodness. Mm-hmm. And the people around me are getting all excited, and they said, push it all the way over. I figure, well, okay, why not? Before I did that, I looked at my fingers because I wanted to see whether or not I was applying force.
Yes.
And I had not been applying force. I was touching it, but I was touching it just gently. So with one finger, taking the edge of the spoon, I simply pressed it all the way over and basically folded the bowl of the spoon over.
Huh.
And then, I'm sort of looking at it dumbfounded.
Yes.
Because I know I did it. And what came to mind was that people would talk about the spoon feeling spongy or like taffy. And that is exactly what it felt like. It felt like clay or like a piece of taffy momentarily. And then it hardened up immediately, and it couldn't budge, and to this day it hasn't budged.
Huh. Well, you can only imagine that your mind, if you did it, your mind somehow modified the atomic structure of that spoon at a certain point, enabling it to be taffy-like. I mean, there really is no...
Well, so after this event, I immediately go back to the literature, and there was a lot done on this in the 1970s. And the conclusion that was reached back then was it is a real phenomena. It doesn't happen all the time. When it happens, it leaves a mark. The thing is bent, so you can study it. And what it looks like is though there's extreme heat applied to the grain boundary inside the spoon. And, of course, if you're trying to bend it in a certain way, then if the grains all melt along a certain line, then it would be very easy to bend it in that direction.
Yes, sure.
So it can still be a very microscopic effect. But nevertheless, it causes a macroscopic result.
Do you recall anything unusual about your thinking processes during that time?
Not really. I was trying to pay close attention to the woman who never ended up bending the spoon at all. So I think in general I was not paying attention to what I was doing.
Although you were paying attention to the intended process.
Yes. I was trying to mimic something I wished to occur. And so, being a scientist, I immediately wanted to go out and replicate this.
Oh, yes.
Because, you're like holding an impossible object. And I tried, and I wasn't able to do it, and I'm going back on the plane going home, and I'm trying to bend a spoon, and suddenly I get a moment of horror, which it made me understand something about what's going on here. The horror was, I'm trying to bend a spoon in my hand. If I'm successful, does that mean that the wing of the plane is going to fall off? I don't know anything about what just happened here.
Yes.
And as a result, I suddenly realized something about the fear that is associated with these large-scale effects, even though ultimately it might be a microscopic effect.
Thank you very much for bolstering what I already felt. You know how I feel about this.
Right.
And so now we should back up for the sake of the audience a little bit. Let's start out with the Global Consciousness Project itself. Not everybody in this audience even understands what that is. Could you explain it?
Okay. And by the way, this is a nice segue, because in the Global Consciousness Project, we use electronic random number generators. We're trying to change the distribution of random numbers coming out of these devices. We detect the effects through statistics. So we're dealing with...
By the way, are you still using computers, Dean? Or are computers still being used?
Oh, yeah. We now have 70 sites in basically every country around the world.
Oh.
Most of the U.S. states. And what we're doing is we're running these random generators 24 hours a day, continually. Every 5 minutes, they package up samples of random bits that they have, and they send them off to a server at Princeton.
Right.
And anybody can go look at the website if they want to. It gives a full list of the results, and not only that, you can download any of the data. But I would warn you that if you download the data now, it's a lot of data. It's like 100 megabytes per day, because there's so much data being generated. And the point of all this is that we make a hypothesis that mind and matter are related in some way. And this essentially is taking what we used to do in the laboratory with one person trying to mentally influence a random generator and expanding it up to the size of the world. So we take advantage of large-scale events that tend to attract a lot of people's attention around the world.
Like 9/11.
Like 9/11.
All right, so all these eggs, I think Princeton called them eggs, didn't they?
Yeah, egg means electrogiogram. This was a takeoff on the idea of an EEG,
right.
Electroencephalogram.
Right.
So instead of taking the brain wave of a brain, we're taking the brain wave of Gaia's mind, the world's mind.
The world's mind.
So that's where the electrogiogram idea came from.
All right, so these eggs are scattered all over the U.S., all over the world,
right.
And they report back then to Princeton. And anything, I guess the idea is, anytime you begin getting large reports from many eggs that non-randomness has begun to occur, it registers on some kind of graph somewhere. Is that?
That's the hypothesis.
Uh-huh.
So the way that we test this, the way that we have been testing it from the beginning when we started in 1998, is there are two basic types of events that can occur. It's either something planned, like New Year's, or something not planned, like 9/11. So if it's planned, we make a prediction in advance. We're going to look at the data at this time for this length of time. If it's an unexpected event, then we use the same 4-hour period, but we, of course, have to look at it retrospectively. And we start from whenever the event occurred, and we go out 4 hours later. Actually, we start 10 minutes before it occurs and goes out later. So to date, we've done 174 events. And these are massive events like 9/11. They're meditations, worldwide meditations, the Madrid bombings, and so on. Lots and lots of things.
Actually, a lot has happened since we last spoke. The Iraq War.
That's right. And in fact, just to give you a sense of it, 9/11 was event number 80, and we're now on event 174.
Wow.
So we're downstream quite a bit. One of the things that we've done is we wanted to see, well, what is the overall evidence at this point that we're getting non-random behavior? And the odds as of a few days ago was somewhere between 10 million to 100 million to 1. And the reason why there are two different odds there is because we did attract the attention of some outside physicists, because we published an article in Foundations of Physics Letters, which is a mainstream physics journal. And we've had people then go back into the raw data and replicate, reanalyze what we have been doing independently to make sure that we hadn't made a mistake. Mm-hmm. And they end up with a slightly different result. Like they have 10 million to 1, whereas our result might be 100 million to 1. Well, there's a difference there, but they're still far from chance.
Yes, far, far from chance. Well, I recall that when I first began to learn of the existence of this project, of course, I went straight to the people at Princeton, and frankly, they didn't want much at all to do with me. In fact, they didn't want much at all to do with any kind of publicity. They were scared to death of publicity, is what I recall.
Well, for good reason. I mean, the analogy here is that we start talking about the Hubble telescope, And you say, tonight if you look out overhead, you can see the Hubble telescope. Let's everyone shine your flashlight and light it up.
Uh-huh.
And of course, that defeats the purpose of the thing itself. What we're dealing with is a measuring instrument, which is in the background, measuring mass consciousness. And so we don't want people to direct their thoughts at it, because it'll screw up the monitoring process.
Screw up the whole experiment, really?
Yeah.
Potentially, sure.
So that's why the experiment is designed as a passive monitor and not as something to be aimed at.
Aimed at is right. And that's all it takes to aim at it is to think about it, right?
For a large number of people to be coherent in their attention. So, unfortunately, right now, a lot of people are being coherent in the sense that they're all paying attention to this topic.
Right.
So we are adding noise to the system.
As a matter of fact, on a prior show, we actually made an attempt. I believe we had sort of a quasi-official report going on and got back some information that indicated that we'd had some effect, right?
The possibility of an effect.
Yes, uh-huh. And, of course, it just went, I exaggerate, but it went right off the charts at the 9/11 event. And there's some things about it that bear discussion. For example, the fact that it seemed to begin to go off the charts, my words, prior to the actual event itself. Is that right?
That is right. 3 to 4 hours before the events unfolded, there began to be a very striking change in the random numbers.
Yes.
Now, which leads us, we probably won't make it because of the time right now, but when we come back... 2
questions of time, actually, right?
Yes. When we come back, I'll tell you something which is far more amazing.
All right.
About 9/11.
All right. Stay right there. My guest is Dean Radin, and to some degree we are violating the sanctity of the experiment going on at Princeton by even talking about this, but it